everybody. My name is Laura, and yes, I am Dad Aspie. And today, on this episode of Busting the Stigma, we're going to talk a little bit about the changes between the DSM-IV and the DSM-V. Specifically talking about the changes with autism spectrum disorder, as it's written in both of those things. I've probably lightly referenced this in previous videos, but there were certain changes in the DSM as to how autism and the autism spectrum is defined with the DSM-IV versus the DSM-V. I believe this change happened around 2013, at least from what I was researching. That seemed to be what it said. I could be wrong. But what I do remember is how I felt about those changes at the time that it happened, versus how I feel about that now, since having a better understanding of why those changes were made and maybe a possible benefit that could have come out of it. For fair warning, and I may put a content warning thing at the beginning of the video, there's going to be a brief discussion about the Nazi Party of World War II Germany, and a little bit about eugenics. So if those are topics that are not quite vibing with you, or like it's a difficult topic for you, then now would be a good time to heed that content warning. If there's any other warnings that I missed, please let me know. I want to make sure that, I don't want to accidentally trigger people with this sort of stuff. That's not my intention at all. So the first thing that's worth understanding with the differences in the DSM-IV and the DSM-V is, well, what the changes are even in the first place. Under the DSM-IV, the autism spectrum had the labels of autistic disorder, Asperger's syndrome or Asperger's disorder, Rett syndrome, childhood disintegrative disorder, and pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. It basically had more categories that fit under that spectrum. Like, they split it up a little bit more, and I guess they were trying to recognize, more of the differences between all of them, despite the fact that they all fell under the same autism umbrella. Now, when it comes to this stuff, the biggest difference that was made into the DSM-V was that Rett syndrome and childhood disintegrative disorder is not included in the autism spectrum disorders list. And on top of that, they lumped Asperger's with autistic disorder, so now it's just autism spectrum disorder, and then they kind of go by if it's mild, moderate, severe, whatever. They also lumped in pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, into autism spectrum disorder. So it's now they kind of added, on top of the mild, moderate, severe, PDD-NOS would be, the borderline of the spectrum, I guess. At least from what I understand of how it is. Apparently, with this change that happened in 2013, nobody that had already been diagnosed with any of the autism spectrum disorders would really be affected by this. At least that was the intention that seemed to be a thing. If you already been diagnosed with any of those disorders, it shouldn't change much about treatment, therapies, anything like that. It's kind of like they gave it a new name, but maybe also looking at it slightly differently than they had before. I guess the biggest thing is that if, you got, disability services or anything like that through the government because of your disability, then they probably would have had to check under the new definition just to be sure that you still qualify under there, but it shouldn't have changed much. And bear in mind, this is all from the clinical side of all of this. Now, thinking back to 2013, when I first heard that these changes were happening, or at least somewhere around that time when I heard these changes were happening. I can't remember specifically when, but I do remember how I felt at the time. I wasn't happy with it at first. I'll be honest. I think part of the reason why I wasn't happy with this change at first was because I finally found something that I guess I fit well with, it gave me a better understanding of who I was, because I spent so much of my life knowing that I was different from everybody else, but never exactly knowing why. I also went through a long period of fighting over and over again to make sure that I had the answer to that question, even if it was a no, before moving to New York City for college. And I guess, that change, taking away that category that made sense to me, it kind of annoyed the crap out of me at first. I was also a bit younger at the time and new to the adult life and figuring out who the fuck I even am. So I guess, those feelings would, if I knew somebody else was going through all of that, then I would feel it's kind of understandable. However, over time and after learning a little bit more about why these changes happened and learning a little bit about the history of Hans Asperger, who came up with the coin turn for Asperger's syndrome, or however you can word that, we found out a little bit more about him through research and studies and things like that, and found out that maybe having the association with him taken away isn't that bad at all. So the studies that I'm talking about was about how Hans Asperger got to this research and what he contributed to certain parties. So if you don't know who Hans Asperger is, he is a Austrian physician who was around like during World War II. He found that there were people that had autism but did not have the language lack of development that was the same. So basically, he found like that mild point where people still had symptoms of autism and still had the characteristics, but did not have the language development issues that, say, someone with regular autism would have. And some of that research came into what eventually was known as Asperger's syndrome, and some people still know it as that to this day. The thing is, remember that Hans Asperger was around during World War II. And what was also around during World War II in the Austria-Germany area was the Nazi Party. And there were things coming up that connected Hans Asperger to the Nazi Party. It wasn't like he was, like, actively a Nazi or anything like that. But he did cooperate with them, with the research that he had, and knowingly used that research to help them figure out, I guess, how to eradicate them and things like that. Essentially, he was involved in helping them figure out what people were worth, like, being euthanized and things like that, and also through, like, eugenics studies. Because a lot of eugenics studies happened during World War II. Like, let's not beat around the bush about that. The fact that he was cooperating with them is problematic, obviously. So learning about that stuff, and I'll post like links to articles and things in the description that help, like, if you want to get a better understanding of the involvement that he had with assisting the Nazi Party, and a little bit in general about who he is and like the changes in the DSM anyway. But to go back to that, as I learned more about that, I kind of felt a little bit better about the changes to the DSM-V, to be honest, because the association to a scientist that contributed to the Nazi Party is, like, it can make people very uncomfortable with that fact. Now, don't get me wrong, the fact that he found that this mild subset of autism was a thing, cool. I just don't like how he used that information, or how the people who got his information used it. Besides the positive things that may have come out of it, I'm talking more about, like, the camps and things. But yeah, I can understand if people don't want the association with Asperger's syndrome because of that, and it's completely understandable. And I like that it gave me a better, like, transition into, okay, this is how the change actually can be helpful. Because there's less of that association with it. Although it did come from there, we can recognize that. We're not going to erase the history of it. It's just better to know the truth. On top of that, a lot of what helped me come to terms with the changes was time and experience. Like I said, at the time that I found out about these changes, I was young. I was very confused about the world around me and about myself. And I just finally had something that made sense to me, and I just didn't want to feel like that was being taken away. So that's why I felt the way I did. But over time, I started to understand more and more about, I guess, my life in general, that I ended up being able to move on, and I feel a little bit better about it. Like, if it does lead to a better understanding of how everything is, then great. That's cool. The closest comparison I can think of this that would be on a more positive note is the transition from calling dissociative identity disorder what it is now instead of multiple personality disorder, because clinically they don't call it that anymore. And part of it is because they have a better understanding of dissociating to such a high level that you create all these amnesic walls. But that's another topic, and I can definitely recommend a system or two that might be able to help explain all that stuff if you want to learn more about dissociative identity disorder. But long story short, I felt weird about it at first. I didn't like it. I wasn't happy about it because it was like, what? The thing I understand is suddenly not the thing anymore? But now that time has passed and more information is given on it, and I did my research, I did my homework, it's fine. But I hope more and more people understand like what the changes are and all these different things, and also are willing to educate themselves and do their research and things from reliable sources and talking to doctors and stuff. But yeah, that about does it for this video. It's a little shorter and it's a little less information heavy, but yeah, I hope this was helpful, and thank you so much for watching and listening. If you like what you see here, feel free to hit that subscribe button, maybe ring the little bell so that it will notify you when new videos come out, and check out other stuff that I do on top of this. Yeah, I think that's about it for now, but until next time, bye everyone!